Sleet battered the windows of the clubhouse that winter afternoon, and I had come to check on the automated external defibrillator (AD) station I'd just installed near the main door. The fluorescent bulb in the hallway flickered disconcertingly as I stepped inside. My heart thumped. The device's small green LED indicator wasn't shining as brightly as it should. In fact, it wasn't shining at all. I rushed forward and immediately saw the cord dangling free from the wall outlet. Someone had unplugged it. I let out a breath that fogged in the cold air, kneeling to examine the cable and the life-saving kit. The device, new and pristine, had been tampered with. It had never crossed my mind that anyone would sabotage an emergency medical station, but there it was, powerless on the wall. I realized with a mix of shock and dread that a single small act of vandalism could cost someone their life. Gathering my composure, I called out into the musty stillness of the empty clubhouse. "Is anyone here?" The echo of my voice returned, hollow and unnerving. I reached for my phone, prepared to document the tampering, then paused. This was my first winter in the neighborhood, and already I was questioning the sanity of living under the rigid, micromanaging authority of the local homeowners association, otherwise known as the dreaded HOA. I had installed the AED station to be a good neighbor, especially with so many retirees in the community who might need quick access to emergency medical equipment. Until recently, my intentions seemed well received by most. Then had come the complaints, anonymous, but suspiciously typed with immaculate grammar and punctilious language. The typed letters demanded the removal of the unsightly blinking light that apparently ruined the clubhouse's atmosphere. A creeping suspicion told me who was behind it: the infamous HOA Karen. She was a woman in her late 50s who paraded around with an air of regal authority. Strict, judgmental, easily offended. She had become a local legend for enforcing rules that many residents had never even heard of. Rumor had it she'd measured the lengths of people's grass down to the inch, complained about children's chalk drawings on the sidewalk, and insisted that only a precise shade of eggshell white was permissible for front doors. HOA Karen had certainly earned her nickname. If she'd found a reason to detest the small blinking light indicating the AED's readiness, I could only imagine her fury once she realized it was a permanent fixture. But tampering with a medical device took things beyond petty annoyance. This was sabotage, pure and simple, an act that could cost a life. I glared at the unplugged cable, at once furious and anxious. This was not the start to my month that I had hoped for. I reconnected the AED, satisfied that its status light blinked a healthy green. Then, with my phone, I recorded a quick video of the damage, the disconnection, and the state of the machine. "Unbelievable," I said under my breath, my anger echoing inside the empty clubhouse. And so I left, my mind already churning through possible ways to handle the matter. Should I report it? Should I confront the board? Or should I confront the likely culprit directly? Stay tuned. This is only the beginning of the story. You won't believe what happens next. The following morning, the sky was an iron-gray dome overhead. From my kitchen window, I saw an official HOA vehicle parked on the street. I felt a rush of nerves, as if my stomach had transformed into a nest of writhing snakes. The doorbell rang. I peered through the side window and recognized the silhouette: short, styled hair, a perfect posture, and that severe expression. There was no mistaking HOA Karen. Tightening the belt on my robe, I opened the door to face her. She wore a prim winter coat and clutched a thin file folder, which she held like a weapon. "You have a moment?" she asked, voice clipped. I nodded, my mouth set in a polite line. "Certainly. Would you like to come in?" The corners of her mouth twitched as though she'd tasted something sour. No. This won't take long." She shot a glance over my shoulder, as if checking whether my interior decor complied with the HOA guidelines. Finally, her eyes met mine. "I have a few questions about the machine you installed near the clubhouse." "By machine, you mean the defibrillator? The life-saving AED?" My polite tone held the faintest edge. "Yes, of course." She pursed her lips. "It's causing quite a disturbance. The blinking light is irritating. I've received multiple complaints about how it distracts from the architectural ambience." She opened the file folder, flipping through carefully. "It's also possible it violates certain HOA lighting restrictions." I felt my pulse spike. A blinking green LED the size of my fingernail violates lighting restrictions? Karen pressed her lips together. It's all in the bylaws. If you'd read them carefully, you'd know that any additions involving lighting, especially colored lighting, must be approved by the board beforehand. Additionally, the clubhouse is designated as a strictly regulated space. Unapproved equipment is subject to immediate removal. I stared, stunned and infuriated. Did she truly believe this was a legitimate complaint? This is an emergency device. It can literally save a life. I can't imagine that a single blinking diode is an eyesore to the community, especially if it means helping someone in a cardiac emergency. She was unmoved, crossing her arms with a haughty sniff. The rules are the rules. You can't simply install equipment on HOA property without approval. We have to consider aesthetics. We also have to consider potential liabilities, so we'll be looking into it. I stood firm, trying not to let the anger push me over the edge. And yet, in many neighborhoods across the country, AED stations are welcomed and even recommended, especially near community centers. This is not some random vanity project. People's lives matter more than your lighting restrictions. Karen bristled. There's no need to be dramatic. We have a perfectly functioning 911 service. Besides, if we truly needed such a device, the board would have coordinated the installation, not an individual. She closed her folder with a snap. I'm just doing my job, ensuring this neighborhood is maintained properly. Good day. With that, she walked away, leaving me fuming on the doorstep. My mind spun with the question, had she been the one who unplugged it? It seemed likely. And if that was the case, what else might she do to get her way? Something about the gleam in her eye, the air of superiority, everything pointed to her being behind the sabotage. But I had no proof. Over the next week, more bizarre incidents occurred. The AED's battery indicator, which I checked daily, stopped blinking for the second time, then the third. Each instance, I discovered the device unplugged. The final straw was the day I arrived to see that the entire station had been covered in a plastic garbage bag, taped down with multiple strips of duct tape. The sight of it was so outlandish that I froze, hardly able to believe my eyes. I ripped the tape away and discovered a scrawled note on HOA letterhead. This device is not in compliance. Remove it immediately or face fines and further actions. My blood boiled as I stuffed the note into my pocket, glancing around the empty corridor. A sense of outrage surged inside me. I was not going to back down. This was not just petty annoyance. Tampering with an AED station was a criminal act, an interference with essential medical equipment. I dialed the non-emergency police line, explaining the situation. They advised I gather documentation to present a possible case if the sabotage continued, though they seemed unsure how actively they could intervene with an HOA dispute. My next call was to a close friend, Danielle, who worked with the local Red Cross. She listened, appalled, and suggested that if the HOA persisted in tampering with a defibrillator, it might be a matter for more serious legal or civil action. We agreed to stay in touch, and she offered to pass the information along to a colleague who specialized in public health outreach. I had never imagined a simple act of community goodwill, installing an AED, would spark so much drama. But in this neighborhood, apparently, everything was open for micromanagement. My patience were thin. I decided to gather the other residents for a conversation, hoping their rational minds would overrule Karen's pettiness. One cold Saturday morning, I arranged a small meeting at the clubhouse. The intention was to educate neighbors on the AED, how it worked, and the importance of having it readily available. I had prepared a short demonstration and printed pamphlets from the Red Cross. I arrived early to set up in the main lounge. As I tested the projector, neighbors trickled in. An elderly couple from across the street, a young father wrangling twin toddlers, and the newlywed couple who'd just moved in. The turnout was modest but encouraging. We had about 15 people in total. I greeted them warmly. Thank you all for coming. I know there's been some confusion about the AED device I installed. I want to clarify its purpose and hopefully address concerns. Smiles and nods circulated around the group. Everyone seemed genuinely curious, except for one woman who lingered at the door, arms folded tight across her chest. Karen stood there in a brown coat, watching me with a hawk-like stare. A hush settled as she cleared her throat. Before we begin, she announced, I'd like to remind everyone that no official board approval has been given for this installation. We are currently investigating whether it violates HOA guidelines. No official demonstration has been sanctioned. You're all here at your own discretion. A ripple of uncertainty disturbed the group. I struggled to maintain composure. Thank you, Karen, for that reminder. However, this is purely an informational session. If anyone wants to leave, they're free to do so. But I'm hoping we can all learn something useful about how AEDs can save lives. No one moved to leave, and Karen fixed me with a tight, withering smile before she chose a seat at the very back. I launched into my presentation, explaining the basics. An automated external defibrillator is designed for public use. It has voice prompts that guide you through the steps of helping someone in cardiac arrest. I demonstrated, showing them the pads and how the machine would analyze a heart's rhythm. People leaned forward, intrigued, and I saw a real engagement in their eyes. Then I gave them hypothetical scenarios. Imagine someone collapses by the pool from sudden cardiac arrest. While waiting for paramedics, an on-site AED can dramatically improve the person's chances of survival. Every minute without defibrillation and CPR can decrease survival rates significantly. Karen coughed, an obvious attempt to draw attention. And who will pay for the liability if it fails, or if an untrained neighbor uses it incorrectly? A small tension rose in the group. I calmly answered. In many states, Good Samaritan laws protect individuals who attempt to aid someone in an emergency, especially with devices like AEDs. Furthermore, training is recommended but not strictly required to use an AED. The device itself provides instructions, and the Red Cross is always willing to provide short training classes if the HOA wishes to host them. She raised an eyebrow. I see. And the bright green light? Is that truly necessary? I forced a smile. That light is the readiness indicator. It ensures that the battery is charged and the device is functioning properly. It's also a quick visual cue so people know it's operational. The good news is that, typically, it's not distracting unless you stare at it in the dark. Several neighbors turned to look at Karen, their expressions a mixture of confusion and annoyance. One older woman piped up, "That blinking light is smaller than a Christmas tree bulb. I don't see how it's a problem." I felt a spark of hope. Clearly, the neighbors recognized how absurd it was to oppose a tiny blinking LED that could save a life. I plowed forward with my demonstration, concluding with an open Q&A. The group responded with gratitude and enthusiasm. A few people came up afterward and shook my hand or patted my shoulder. Karen stayed near the back, suspiciously quiet. But as the crowd began to disperse, she approached me stiffly. "You should know," she said, voice low, "that the HOA board has convened an emergency meeting. Next Tuesday, we'll be deciding the fate of this so-called life-saving device." I stared into her cold expression. "I suppose I'll be there." She gave a curt nod. "I strongly suggest you read the bylaws before then." That night, I could hardly sleep. I pored over the HOA guidelines, a labyrinth of baffling regulations. So many sections, amendments, disclaimers. My eyes blurred as I read about paint colors, fence heights, acceptable garden decorations, pet rules, and more. I found one vague reference to exterior lighting fixtures that might apply to the AED's LED. But nowhere did I see a stipulation forbidding emergency medical devices. My mind reeled at the idea that anyone would interpret these rules to ban an AED. Tuesday came all too soon. I arrived at the cramped conference room in the clubhouse to face the board. 5 members, all retired or semi-retired, wore serious expressions behind a long folding table. Karen sat second from the right, posture stiff, eyes gleaming with what I could only interpret as smug confidence. The board president, a balding man named Bob, cleared his throat. "We're here to discuss the newly installed AED station near the clubhouse entrance," he began. "This device was installed without prior board approval, which is a matter of concern." I tried to keep my voice steady. "I understand. However, I believed we could expedite the installation of a life-saving device, especially with the advanced age of many residents. It's not intended for decoration, but for saving lives." Karen cut in. "We appreciate the sentiment, but we must consider rules and potential liability. This device could cause legal complications if someone misuses it or if it malfunctions." I inhaled slowly, steadying myself. Numerous communities around the country have AEDs installed in public areas. Good Samaritan laws usually protect both the user and property owners, as long as the device is maintained and used in good faith. I can provide references from the Red Cross if you wish. The treasurer, a kindly older woman named Ruth, adjusted her glasses. "I'd like to see that documentation." I'm not entirely opposed, but I need to understand the cost, the upkeep, whether we can incorporate it officially, that sort of thing. Bob coughed. Yes. Well, the board must vote. I'd like to propose a motion. We table final decisions until we gather more information. In the meantime, we request that the device's blinking light be covered or turned off, so as not to disturb the aesthetic environment. Once we have more clarity, we can decide whether to keep it or remove it. I started to protest, but Karen interrupted. Yes, I second that motion. The blinking light is unsightly. If the device is truly so necessary, we can find ways to keep it from violating our aesthetic standards. Outrage flared in my chest. It's a single LED that indicates whether the device is working. Covering or disabling it defeats the purpose. It must remain visible to confirm the battery is fully charged. Karen shrugged, an infuriatingly dismissive gesture. If it's essential, perhaps we can install a smaller light or a dimmer version, or place the device somewhere less visible, like a closet. My hands clenched the armrests of my chair. That would add precious seconds in an emergency. It needs to be out in the open. Accessible. Seconds can be the difference between life and death. Bob waved his hands, attempting to restore order. Let's keep this civil. We have a motion on the table. All in favor of. But the door to the conference room burst open, interrupting him. Danielle from the Red Cross swept in, an apologetic smile on her face. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm here on behalf of the Red Cross. I understand there are questions about the AED. For a moment, the board members stared, startled. Karen turned a shade paler, her mouth tightening. Danielle introduced herself politely. She showed her credentials, then handed out informational packets explaining the critical need for quick defibrillation in cases of sudden cardiac arrest. Bob flipped through the packets. Ruth's eyes widened. The other board members exchanged glances. Danielle explained calmly. Tampering with or removing an AED can have severe legal and moral repercussions. If someone experiences a cardiac emergency and the AED isn't accessible or functioning, the HOA could face liability, and, more importantly, someone could lose their life unnecessarily. Red Cross strongly recommends that all communities have accessible AEDs. Karen cleared her throat, clearly rattled but attempting to maintain control. We appreciate this information, but we also have rules about modifications to the property. We must weigh all sides of this issue. Danielle nodded graciously. Of course, I only want to emphasize that many HOAs embrace AEDs and even incorporate them into their emergency preparedness plans. We'd be happy to provide training to residents. And as for the blinking light, typically it's extremely discreet. Karen cut her off with a condescending wave. But you don't have to live with it in your backyard, do you? Danielle's eyebrows rose. Actually, many organizations do have these devices in close proximity. My own church, my sister's condominium building, local gyms, community centers, none have reported issues with the indicator light. If you'd like to see examples. Bob coughed again, glancing from Karen to Danielle. I think we have enough to consider. For now, let's schedule a formal vote at next month's meeting. In the meantime, we'll advise caution around the device. It's not to be tampered with or removed. That includes no covering of the blinking light, no unplugging, and no further modifications. Is that acceptable to everyone? Karen tightened her lips. I still think it's an unwelcome intrusion. But fine, if we must wait for the board to finalize a decision, so be it. With that, the meeting adjourned, leaving me feeling both relieved and uneasy. The board hadn't outlawed the AED yet, but Karen's hostility remained, a viper coiled, ready to strike. In the following days, a hush seemed to fall over the clubhouse. On the surface, everything appeared normal. The defibrillator's green light continued its mild blinking, unaffected. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was scheming. True to form, a few nights later, my doorbell rang. The moment I opened the door, my heart sank. There she stood in the glow of my porch lamp, her arms crossed over a thick binder. Good evening, she said in a clipped tone. I'd like to speak to you about some complaints. I fought the urge to roll my eyes. Complaints about the AED again? She thrust the binder out. Yes, several residents feel that your device is invasive. They find the blinking light distracting. I frowned. Several residents? Really? Because at the meeting, I heard mostly support. Karen's eyes narrowed. The majority may not always be the loudest, but we all must respect the bylaws. The board meeting might have ended in a stalemate, but I'm not done investigating. For instance, did you know that installing an AED in a public space might require special permits in this state? You might also need to register it with local emergency services. I blinked. It's not typical to require a permit for an AED. Registration is sometimes recommended, not mandated. But if we can register it for easier 911 operator assistance, that's a plus. I'm happy to do that. She looked momentarily flummoxed. Well, good. You should. But until everything is official, I suggest you not tamper further with the property. A bitter laugh escaped me. I'm not the one tampering with it, Karen. Someone keeps unplugging the AED. Someone covered it with a garbage bag, and I'm fairly certain it wasn't a phantom. The color rose in her cheeks. I have no idea who did that. Perhaps a concerned resident who didn't want to be subjected to a blinking advertisement for a machine they never asked for. Now, if you'll excuse me. But I blocked her path as she turned to leave, my heart pounding. Excuse me, I said, stepping onto the porch. I think we need to address the real issue. Unplugging an AED is vandalism, and it can cost someone their life. If you had anything to do with that. She drew herself up, her face turning an angry pink. How dare you accuse me? I'm an HOA board member. I'd never do anything so foolish. I clenched my fists at my sides, forcing calm. I'm sure you wouldn't want to face legal consequences if it ever led to harm. Trust me, the Red Cross is aware that this tampering is going on. If it happens again, they'll notify authorities. Karen's eyes flashed with indignation. She gave a stiff shrug. Suit yourself. But if that device remains an eyesore, I'll keep pushing the board to remove it. I stared at her as she marched back to her car. My breath came in ragged spurts of anger. There was no reasoning with this woman. Despite Karen's threats, the next couple of weeks passed without incident. The AED remained operational. Neighbors occasionally asked questions about how to use it, and I felt encouraged that maybe the situation was calming down. Then came the night that changed everything. It was just past 9 p.m. when I heard frantic pounding on my door. I hastened to open it, and there stood a teenage boy, wide-eyed, gasping for breath. I recognized him as the grandson of one of our elderly residents, Mrs. Lindstrom. He managed to spit out between ragged breaths. My grandma. She collapsed in the clubhouse. I called 911, but they said the paramedics are coming from the next town over. They're slow tonight. She's not breathing. Please hurry. Adrenaline shot through me. The AED, did you bring it? He shook his head, pale. I didn't think of it. Oh God, hurry. I grabbed my coat and sprinted after him, my heart hammering. We reached the clubhouse in minutes, bursting through the entrance. Mrs. Lindstrom lay on the floor, unconscious, her face an alarming gray color. A small group of neighbors had gathered, some attempting CPR, while others called out in panic. I dashed to the wall where the AED was installed, silently praying it would be functional. My stomach swooped when I saw the device was gone. A note in large, looping handwriting was taped to the bracket. Removed for compliance review. By order of the HOA. My vision blurred in fury and terror. Someone had forcibly removed the AED. Oh my God, I gasped, scanning the area. No sign of the bright red case. Karen, she had to be behind this. One neighbor knelt in tears, trying to do chest compressions on Mrs. Lindstrom. Another neighbor shouted that the ambulance was still 10 minutes away. Time stretched painfully. A wave of helplessness washed over me. We need that AED. I roared, searching the surrounding area. Maybe it had been stashed somewhere. Just then, I saw a door to a small supply closet slightly ajar. I hurried over and flung it open. There, behind cleaning supplies and stacked chairs, lay the bright red defibrillator case. In an instant, I snatched it, unzipped it, and confirmed the green light was blinking. Relief coursed through me. I've got it, I yelled. Scrambling to Mrs. Lindstrom's side, I turned on the unit. The AED's automated voice guided us. Remove clothing from the patient's chest. Another neighbor helped tear open her blouse. Attach pads to bare skin. My hands shook, but I placed the pads exactly as shown, praying the device would analyze quickly and recommend a shock if needed. The machine beeped, then calmly, analyzing heart rhythm. Everyone stand clear. We stepped back, breath bated. Another beep. Shock advised. Press the flashing shock button. With trembling fingers, I pressed the button. A jolt of electricity surged through Mrs. Lindstrom's body. She twitched, and for a moment everything seemed to freeze in time. Then the machine's voice resumed. Begin CPR. Someone took over compressions, counting aloud. Another person tilted her head to give rescue breaths. We followed the machine's calm instructions. Sweat dripped down my forehead as the seconds dragged into minutes. My heart pounded in rhythm with the compressions, each one hammered out in desperation to bring her back. Finally, we heard sirens approaching. EMTs burst in, swiftly took over, hooking up oxygen and praising us for using the AED. They carted Mrs. Lindstrom onto a gurney, continuing advanced treatment. She still wasn't conscious, but she was alive enough to have a fighting chance. Shaken, neighbors gathered in tense silence as the ambulance whisked her away. In that hush, I heard a familiar gasp. I turned to see Karen standing at the edge of the room, her expression ashen. She was clutching a ring of keys in one hand, likely the keys to the closet. For an instant, she met my eyes, face twisted in guilt, shock, and a hint of fear. Then she shrank back into the shadows. Word of Mrs. Lindstrom's close call spread through the neighborhood the next day. There was talk that the doctors said she'd had a major cardiac event, and the immediate use of an AED might have saved her life. People were relieved, but also outraged upon discovering that the machine had been hidden in a closet. Tongues wagged. Neighbors whispered, "Who would do such a thing?" A few folks had seen Karen with the AED the day before. The suspicion was heavy in the air. I was in my driveway, scraping ice off the windshield of my car, when I saw her approach, her face strained. She stood there in the cold, the wind whipping stray hairs around her rigid features. I didn't want anyone to get hurt," she blurted. I was concerned about the liability. I never meant. Rage boiled in my chest. "Are you admitting you removed the AED?" She swallowed, eyes darting. "I locked it in the supply closet so it wouldn't cause trouble. I planned to return it after the board officially authorized it. I never dreamed someone would actually need it." My voice shook. "Mrs. Lindstrom almost died. We needed the AED, and you hid it. Do you realize how dangerous that was? How irresponsible?" She flinched at the raw fury in my voice. "It's not my fault she had a heart attack. You act like I caused that. I was just following the rules." Rules? The rules do not say you can hide a life-saving device. Even if it wasn't approved yet, the board never told you to remove it. You did that on your own. My eyes burned with anger. If she had died, you'd have to live with that on your conscience, and possibly face legal consequences. Her lips quivered. "I didn't unplug it this time. I was trying to do what was best. If the device is unapproved and something bad happens, the HOA could be sued." I practically shouted. "And now you see the irony. By hiding it, you almost caused something far, far worse. This is more than a petty rule. This is life and death." The Red Cross has officially stated that tampering with an AED can have severe legal ramifications. Did you not hear Danielle at the meeting? Tears glistened in her eyes. For a moment, I thought she might lash out, but her shoulders sagged. She let out a shaky breath, whispering, "I never wanted this to happen." I inhaled, struggling between anger and pity. "Karen, you can't keep meddling in every single aspect of this neighborhood without considering the human cost. Mrs. Lindstrom almost died. If I hadn't found the AED in time." She bowed her head, speechless. I must have stood there for a full minute while the wind cut through us, each second heavy with unspoken condemnation. At last, she sniffed, lifted her head, and turned, hurrying away down the sidewalk. 2 days later, the community buzzed with the news. The local Red Cross was calling an emergency meeting with the HOA board. Danielle had evidently shared the near tragedy with her organization. They wanted to discuss the seriousness of removing or disabling an AED. The board assembled in the clubhouse. This time, more residents showed up than I had ever seen at an HOA meeting. Chairs lined every wall, and a few people stood against the back. Karen sat to one side, noticeably subdued, her usual arrogance dampened by a swirl of social condemnation. Bob cleared his throat. "We're here to finalize a decision about the AED, among other urgent matters. But first, we have a representative from the Red Cross." A man in a crisp shirt and tie stepped up to the front. "Hello, everyone. My name is Michael, and I'm a Red Cross official. We were informed that a recently installed AED was tampered with and removed from accessibility, an action that nearly resulted in a tragic outcome. I want to make it crystal clear that removing or disabling an AED can endanger lives. If someone suffers a cardiac arrest, and the device is unavailable or not functioning, precious minutes are lost. He paused, scanning the audience. Everyone was silent, including Karen. He continued, in some states, knowingly preventing access to an AED or damaging it could lead to legal liability. It's also morally untenable for a community to block a device that could save a neighbor's life. The Red Cross strongly urges you to keep the AED installed, powered, and clearly visible. We are ready to help with any training or registration needed. The crowd murmured in agreement. People shot looks at Karen, who stared at her folded hands. Bob cleared his throat again. Thank you, Michael. The board has discussed the matter at length. We've concluded that the device has the support of our community, especially after the incident with Mrs. Lindstrom. The final vote is to keep the AED. We will also accept the Red Cross's assistance to register it with local emergency services and provide a training session for any interested residents. A round of applause erupted from the crowd. I felt an immense weight lift from my chest. Relief, triumph, and gratitude washed over me. Finally, reason had prevailed. But the meeting wasn't done. Ruth, the treasurer, raised her hand. I'd like to address the matter of liability regarding the tampering. We all know who took it upon themselves to hide the device in the closet. All eyes turned toward Karen. She sat rigid, looking as though she might burst into tears again. Bob said, yes, we're aware of the circumstances. We want to be fair, but we also can't ignore the seriousness of what happened. A quiet tension settled over the room. Karen said nothing, her eyes remaining fixed on the table. The hush lengthened. It was Michael, the Red Cross official, who spoke gently. We're not here to punish someone, but to learn from mistakes. As far as the Red Cross is concerned, we just want to ensure this never happens again. Because next time, the outcome could be deadly. Karen swallowed hard, then stood on shaky legs. I'm sorry, she managed, voice thick. I should never have removed the AED. I was so focused on rules and the potential legal ramifications that I lost sight of what's really important. I apologize to everyone. I hope we can move forward. The room was dead silent for a moment. Finally, Bob nodded. Thank you for that acknowledgement. The board will hold a formal disciplinary review. In the meantime, let it be known that no one, including board members, is to interfere with the AED station. That is final. Understood. He looked meaningfully at Karen, who nodded miserably, her eyes bright with tears. A wave of relief and quiet satisfaction drifted through the crowd. Justice was being served, and the community was safe from further sabotage. In the following weeks, the tension gradually eased. The board, under the watchful eye of the Red Cross and local EMS, officially registered the AED. We held training sessions in the clubhouse. I was stunned at the turnout. Dozens of residents showed up, young and old, to learn how to operate the device and perform CPR. Even Karen attended, slipping into a back row seat and observing quietly. She no longer tried to sabotage or remove anything. She made no snide remarks about the blinking indicator light. If anything, she looked haunted by what had nearly happened. As more people became aware of the life-saving importance of the AED, the neighborhood actually began to unite around it. The negativity that had hovered like a storm cloud seemed to dissipate, replaced by a renewed sense of caring for one another's well-being. The relief was palpable. One afternoon, as I walked by the clubhouse, I spotted Karen by the AED station. My heart skipped in alarm, but I approached cautiously, seeing that she wasn't messing with the device. Instead, she stood there, reading the instructions. She touched the case lightly, then stepped back. She must have sensed my presence, because she turned around. Her face was composed but sad. I nearly cost someone her life, she said softly. I can't keep pretending my actions had no consequences. I hesitated, uncertain how to respond. It worked out, in the end. Mrs. Lindstrom is recovering well, and that's what matters. She exhaled shakily, nodding. I've been visiting her in the hospital. I apologized to her son, her grandkids. They've been surprisingly forgiving, but I can't forgive myself that easily. I have a lot to learn about being a decent neighbor. A pang of empathy softened my anger. Everyone makes mistakes, Karen. It's what you do afterward that counts. She swallowed. Then her eyes flicked to the device's blinking light. It really is small, she murmured. I can't believe I thought it was so distracting. I forced a small smile. Sometimes we obsess over the wrong details. Karen gave a slow, regretful nod, then turned and walked away. I watched her figure recede down the corridor. Something told me that maybe, just maybe, she was rethinking her approach to the entire concept of community. Weeks passed, and Mrs. Lindstrom returned home from the hospital. The Red Cross arranged a small ceremony to acknowledge the quick actions of neighbors in saving her life. They presented certificates of appreciation and recognized the new official community AD program. The local newspaper even covered it, praising our neighborhood for its readiness and highlighting the device's importance. In the afterglow of these events, I noticed Karen becoming uncharacteristically quiet. She stopped showing up to random inspections, stopped demanding to see paint swatches. Some said her pride had been broken. Others said she was simply afraid of being further reprimanded by the HOA board. Occasionally, I saw her in her front yard, trimming hedges or pulling weeds, but she kept her head down. Her usual sharp gaze was replaced by something softer, more introspective. One day, I found a short, handwritten note slipped under my door. "Thank you for what you did. I'm sorry for what I did. K." No mention of the blinking light. No mention of the bylaws. Just a short apology. I stood there in the hallway, reading the words twice. Despite everything, I felt a measure of comfort that maybe this was the start of bridging an impossible gap. During the next HOA general meeting, a month after the close call, Bob announced that the board had unanimously decided to keep the AED and support its maintenance. He also declared that tampering with the device would result in immediate fines and potential legal consequences. The entire neighborhood nodded in approval. Karen was present but quiet. When it was time for open floor comments, she stood and cleared her throat. "I'd like to propose a motion to allow a budget allocation for AED maintenance and training, so that we can all be sure it's properly cared for. I'm aware of my previous stance, and I realize now how important it is to be prepared for emergencies." She met no one's eyes, but her tone carried humility. I felt a wave of relief. Perhaps she really had learned her lesson. The motion passed almost instantly, and the tension that once ruled our neighborhood began melting. People clapped, and a sense of communal pride replaced the months of fear and frustration. A few weeks later, Mrs. Lindstrom, walking with a cane and accompanied by her grandson, made a brief appearance at the clubhouse. She wanted to see the defibrillator that had saved her life. We gathered around, an emotional hush in the air. Karen was there too, standing off to one side, her eyes downcast. Mrs. Lindstrom approached the AED station, tears in her eyes. She turned to me, to the neighbors, and said softly, "Thank you, all of you, for caring enough to have this here. My doctor says every minute that passes without help reduces the chance of survival. If this device hadn't been available when I collapsed, I might not be here today." A quiet sob escaped Karen's lips, and she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. I wondered if she was recalling just how close she'd come to destroying that chance. In a surprising display of compassion, Mrs. Lindstrom slowly made her way over to Karen, took her hand, and said, "I heard about what happened. I forgive you." Karen's face crumpled, and she whispered a broken, "Thank you." In that moment, everything changed. The petty grievances, the so-called eyesore, light, the strife about bylaws, it all fell away in the face of genuine gratitude for a life saved. The entire room seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Healing, it seemed, had finally begun. A short time later, the local newspaper ran a follow-up article titled, "Neighborhood Embraces AED After Near Tragedy." It praised the swift response of neighbors and singled out the HOA for reversing its initial resistance. They even interviewed Karen, who spoke contritely. "My intentions were misguided, but I've learned a valuable lesson about community, compassion, and preparedness." From that point on, the neighborhood settled into a more harmonious routine. The HOA was still the HOA. There were still rules, forms, and fines for letting weeds grow too tall. But there was a new undertone of empathy. Karen, once the tyrant of landscaping codes and mailbox uniformity, seemed genuinely tempered by the experience. Her approach softened, her tone gentler. She even assisted the Red Cross with distributing pamphlets for new residents about emergency protocols. On bright mornings, I'd occasionally see her strolling past the clubhouse, glancing at the blinking green light, and then continuing on her way with a small nod. I couldn't say we became friends. We never met for coffee, never chatted casually for more than a minute. But she was no longer the looming threat I'd once dreaded. For me, that was enough. Mrs. Lindstrom continued to recover, regaining strength, eventually giving up her cane. She moved around the neighborhood with a cheerful wave for everyone. Each time I saw her pass the defibrillator station, I felt a surge of pride that I'd fought for its presence. And for all the drama, it was worth it. On a sunny spring morning, I found myself in front of the clubhouse once again, verifying that the AD's battery was up to date. The device glowed with its reassuring green blink, right where it should be. For a moment, I closed my eyes and remembered the day I found it unplugged, the anger, the frustration, the sense of betrayal. We come a long way from that day, from petty sabotage and hidden garbage bags to this newly united stance of readiness. I sensed someone behind me and glanced over my shoulder. Karen had come up quietly, a small smile on her usually stern face. "Everything good with the machine?" she asked, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. I gave a nod. "All good. Battery strong, pads up to date." She hesitated, then said, "I know we're having a big community barbecue next month. Perhaps we could set up a booth for a quick demonstration on how to use it. I think it'd help everyone feel involved." Surprise flickered in my chest. "That's a great idea. I'll talk to the Red Cross about scheduling a short class that day." Karen offered a brief nod. "Good." She lingered a moment, as if searching for more words, but none came. She turned to walk away, then paused. It's a good thing you installed it. No matter how I acted at first, I can see now that it was the right choice." My chest felt unexpectedly tight. "Thank you, Karen. That means a lot." She nodded once more, then departed. I stood there, a mixture of warmth and relief in my heart. The woman who had once embodied the HOA Karen stereotype, the meddling, self-righteous busybody who nearly cost a life, was now recommending we hold a training booth for the device she once despised. Talk about transformation. Sometimes, adversity has a way of bringing out a deeper reflection in people, even those who seem the most stubborn and set in their ways. And perhaps that's the moral of this entire conflict. Communities thrive on cooperation and compassion more than they do on petty rules and rigid bylaws. Even the harshest critic can be changed by a brush with real consequences. We'd all witnessed something extraordinary, how a near tragedy became the turning point for a more cohesive, empathetic neighborhood. The saga of the sabotaged AD had ended with understanding, forgiveness, and a renewed commitment to one another's safety. As I walked away, the crisp air brushed my face, and the small blinking light from the AD station cast its faint green glow against the sunlit corridor, a quiet reminder that sometimes the smallest things can make the biggest difference.